Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video we're going to talk about hormone actions and some types of hormones. There are two major categories of hormones in terms of their mechanism of action, and those two categories are hydrophilic hormones and hydrophobic hormones. For hydrophilic hormones, these are often made of protein, so sometimes they're called protein-based hormones. But I'm not sure that all of them are proteins. The key that they all have in common is that they're hydrophilic, they like water. And then the other category is hydrophobic hormones. These guys obviously don't like water. Sometimes these are called lipid-based hormones. But not all of them are made out of lipids. To give you an example of a hormone that is made of lipids, testosterone and estrogen, these are steroid hormones, and steroid hormones are made out of cholesterol. That's what they're synthesized from. So obviously that's a lipid. But to give you an example of one that doesn't fit in terms of being a lipid hormone, the thyroid hormones T3 and T4, they're actually made out of an amino acid. So they're not made of lipids. They're made of kind of a protein monomer, right? Amino acids. But they have a mechanism of action that follows this hydrophobic scheme. They don't like water, so they have to use that mechanism. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to first show you the hydrophilic hormones mechanism of action, and then I'm going to discuss the hydrophobic hormones mechanism of action, and then we'll do a compare and contrast between the two. For hydrophilic hormones, oops, not hyperophilic, and I guess I didn't need to erase that, did I? Hydrophilic hormones, and again, we're looking at mechanism of action. I'm going to draw a cell. So here's my cell that the hormone is going to have an effect on. And my hormone I'll draw as blue out here. Out here, by the way, if you'll recall from the introduction to the endocrine system, the way hormones are used by the endocrine system, they're synthesized by a gland and then they're released into the tissues around the gland and ultimately into the bloodstream. Then those hormones travel through the bloodstream until they reach their target cells. That means they have to go through the blood. So over here, this is basically representing that hormone inside of the blood. Hydrophilic hormones, because they like water, and blood is mostly water, they dissolve just fine in blood, and they can be transported easily throughout the body in the circulatory system. So this hormone just dissolves easily in the blood and travels in the blood. When it gets down to the tissues, it gets out of the bloodstream and goes to the cell. The receptor for these hydrophilic hormones must be on the surface of the cell. And let's talk briefly about why that is. If we look at a cell membrane, recall from basic biology what the cell membrane is made out of. It's made out of phospholipids. You might remember your instructor drawing phospholipids that look something like this. It's a phospholipid bilayer. These little molecules are called phospholipids. They have a head group that likes water, and they have lipid tails that don't like water. This is important, and the barrier, the cell membrane is a barrier in that it has all of these tails here in the middle of this layer, and that creates a lipid barrier. Things that can dissolve in lipids can go through this barrier, but things that like water and that don't dissolve well in lipids, they can't get through this barrier, at least not easily. Water itself can't get through this barrier without help. So that's the way that the cell membrane is a barrier, and that is why our hydrophilic hormones, again, being something that likes water, it can't just diffuse through the membrane and have an effect inside of the cell. It has to bind to a receptor that is on the surface of the cell. So the hormone binds to its receptor on the surface of the cell, and the receptor leads to the changes inside of the cell, the receptor undergoes some kind of change in here. Either the receptor itself is an enzyme that makes changes in here by phosphorylating other molecules, or another one more commonly that I like to talk about is G protein coupled receptors. This is a complex of proteins, but I'm just going to represent it as big G. That's the G protein. When the hormone binds to the receptor, if it's a G protein coupled receptor, then the receptor will lose that G protein and it'll let it go, and that G protein can go and have other effects. Let me get rid of my cell membrane box here so I can use that space. And we're going to put another protein in the membrane here, and this one we're going to, excuse me, we're going to call this an adenylate cyclase. So hormone bound to its receptor, G protein leaves the receptor then, and it goes over here and it binds to this adenylate cyclase. That activates the adenylate cyclase. The adenylate cyclase's job as an enzyme is to convert this molecule, ATP, that you might remember from talking about energy usage inside the cell. It converts ATP molecules to something called cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP is like the classic example that most even beginning biology students know. This is a second messenger inside of cells. That cyclic AMP is going to lead to the activation of various enzymes and possibly the inactivation of other enzymes, and you're going to see a change in the chemistry inside of this cell. That ultimately is going to be the response to the binding of that hormone. It's going to be the hormone's effects, is whatever chemical changes that leads to inside of the cell. Using this kind of system, requiring a receptor on the surface that leads to changes inside of the cell via second messengers, this is called these are called second messenger systems. So these hydrophilic hormones have their effects via second messenger systems. Another thing I should tell you, this is one example of a second messenger system, and we haven't completed it because it gets more complicated beyond this. This is not the only example of a second messenger system. There's a few. But I do want you to know that hydrophilic hormones act via second messenger systems. And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover for hydrophilic hormone mechanism of action. To recap it real quickly, the hydrophilic hormone dissolves fine in the blood, so it gets into the blood and travels around the body just fine. When it gets to the target cell, it binds to the receptor. The receptor for the hydrophilic hormone must be on the surface of the cell because the hydrophilic hormone can't just go through the cell membrane. That receptor is going to lead to the activation of a second messenger system inside of the cell, and then we'll see the effects. So that's the mechanism of action for hydrophilic hormones. Let me erase this and we'll move on to hydrophobic hormones. Should have left blood over here. And now I'm going to draw another hormone here, but just remember, even though it looks the same, this is a hydrophobic hormone. And I need my cell. And this time we're going to need to look at the nucleus of the cell. And as you know, inside of the nucleus of the cell, we have various things, but certainly we have DNA. So this is my poorly rendered version of DNA. The hydrophobic hormone, just for clarity, let me make sure I write that up here. Hydrophobic hormones, again, most of them are made out of lipids, but not all. The hydrophobic hormone is going to need help to get through the bloodstream. Can you think of why? It's because hydrophobic things, like this hydrophobic hormone, they don't like water, so they don't dissolve well in water. So these hormones need what we call carriers, and I'm going to represent that by putting some larger protein around this hormone. Within the bloodstream, these hydrophobic hormones need carrier proteins in order to travel easily through the blood. They sometimes bind simply to plasma proteins like albumin, and other hormones have specific carriers that they use, but they all need a carrier in order to travel through the bloodstream well. Once they get down to the tissues, however, they can easily diffuse right through the cell membrane to get inside of the cell. Remember that the hydrophilic hormones couldn't do this. But hydrophobic hormones, because they're lipid-based, most of them, because they're hydrophobic, they don't like water, they do like lipids. So they're lipophilic and hydrophobic. They can get through that lipid membrane of the cell membrane that we talked about. They can easily diffuse through. So they get inside of the cell. Their receptor, therefore, is going to be inside of the cell. And I'm going to represent that receptor like this. And you'll see why it's shaped like that in a quick second here. The receptor and the hormone are going to come together. The hormone is going to bind to its receptor. So here's the receptor again. And here's the hormone binding to its binding site on the receptor. When these two get together, the hormone receptor complex turns into what we call a transcription factor. Whoops. It doesn't matter if it's blue, does it? You may recall the word transcription from your earlier biology training. That is talking about gene expression. The reading of the sequence of DNA within a gene in order to synthesize first an mRNA and then ultimately a protein. So we're talking about protein production based on the sequence in DNA. That's what transcription is about. And transcription factors influence transcription. They do it by going into the nucleus if they weren't there already. Sometimes the receptors are actually in the nucleus. And I have to redraw my hormone. Redraw my receptor now. And notice that funny way that I drew the receptor at first. It had two parts to it. One bound to the hormone and the other end is capable of binding to some part of the DNA. And it's usually very specific in terms of the sequence on the DNA that it binds to. And it binds to the gene in what's called a control region of the gene. And by binding to that control region, it influences the expression of that gene. It influences the transcription of that gene. So when this hydrophobic hormone comes in and binds to its receptor and then binds to the DNA, that's going to cause the upregulation of certain gene products or the downregulation of other gene products, or both at the same time. And the either increase of production of certain gene products and the decrease in the production of other gene products is going to lead to the ultimate effects of the hormone. I'll give you one example. Testosterone. You know that if a weightlifter injects testosterone, that helps them get bigger muscles. One of the ways that does that is that by binding to promoter regions on genes such as myosin and actin, the proteins, the major proteins for muscle contraction, that increases the production of actin and myosin and increases the size of the muscle ultimately. So that's one example. So that, in a nutshell, is how hydrophobic hormones work. And I'll go through it again, quick version one more time. The hydrophobic hormone needs a carrier to get through the bloodstream because hydrophobic hormones don't like water. They don't dissolve well in the blood for that reason. But when the hydrophobic hormone gets down to the tissues, it can easily diffuse into the target cells. The target cell will have a receptor that is inside of the cell. The hormone binds to the receptor inside of the cell, and that becomes a transcription factor. It diffuses and binds to the DNA in a certain region and influences the expression of genes, or influences transcription. So we've talked about hydrophilic hormones and we've talked about hydrophobic hormones, mechanisms of action. Let's make the last thing we do here a little talk about comparing and contrasting these two. You should be able, after watching this video and studying a little bit, you should be able to write a good, decent paragraph comparing and contrasting hydrophilic hormone mechanisms of action and hydrophobic hormone mechanism of action. The key points. Remember that hydrophilic hormones can easily dissolve in the blood and therefore easily transport without any help in the blood, whereas hydrophobic hormones require a carrier to be transported easily in the blood. They bind to some protein in order to be transported in the blood. When we get to the cell, remember that the hydrophilic hormones receptor must be on the surface of the cell, because the hydrophilic hormone can't just easily diffuse through the cell membrane and get inside of the cell. Whereas the hydrophobic hormones receptor is going to be inside of the cell. In terms of the effect inside of the cell, remember that the hydrophilic hormone, because it bound to that receptor on the surface and it can't get in, it has to act by second messenger systems. And the classic example of a second messenger is cyclic AMP. Whereas hydrophobic hormones, they bind to their receptor is inside of the cell, and when they bind to their receptor, they become transcription factors. And those transcription factors can bind to the DNA inside of the nucleus and influence transcription. There's a few of the compare and contrasts. You could also talk about what most hydrophobic hormones and most hydrophilic hormones are made out of, because that's different. And you could come up with, I'm sure, a bunch of other areas where you could say there's similarities or differences. Oh, similarities, kind of the obvious ones. These are both hormones, which means they're both produced by some kind of gland, and they both have influences on cells that are distant from those glands. That's probably enough. There's two other major points that I want to include here. Notice from both of those, in order to have their effects, the hormone had to have a receptor. It's very important to understand about the endocrine system and about hormones in general. Hormones can have very specific effects on very specific tissues. That's because only the cells that have the receptor for the hormone are going to be affected by the hormone. If a cell doesn't have a receptor for that particular hormone, you won't see an effect on that cell. The cell will completely ignore the hormone because it doesn't have a receptor for it. And you can imagine how any given hormone could have very broad effects, because if most or all of the cells in the body have a receptor for that hormone, then almost all of the cells in the body are going to be affected by that hormone. A good example is insulin. Insulin is the hormone that causes a decrease in blood sugar. And the way that it does that, almost all cells in the body have insulin receptors. So all of the cells in the body are affected by the hormone. And what happens when the insulin binds is it causes those cells to absorb sugar, to take in sugar. So the sugar moves inside of cells instead of outside of cells, such as in the bloodstream, and that causes a decrease in blood sugar in the bloodstream. To give you an example of targeted and specific and varied effects, we could talk about the adrenalins, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is the more potent, so I like to talk about that one. Epinephrine is a monoamine hormone, which means it's made out of an amino acid. It's also a hydrophilic hormone, and it has various effects on lots of parts of the body. It helps to increase breathing rate, helps to increase heart rate, helps to decrease digestive function, helps to decrease bathroom functions. And the reason it can have these varied effects, increasing some functions while decreasing other functions, is also interesting. The same hormone can have different receptors on different cells, and those receptors can have different effects when the hormone binds. So a certain receptor to epinephrine might cause a cell membrane to be more excitable, such as the heart cells. It causes an increase in excitability there, and that leads to an increase in heart rate. Whereas the same hormone acting on the digestive tract can have a decreased effect. It can decrease the activity of that cell. So again, you can have varied effects with the same hormone depending on the receptor involved. I think that's all I wanted to discuss right now. In fact, I think I went beyond what I wanted to, and I hope it's helpful to you. I like to put some questions at the end. So these are questions that after I state the question, you could pause the video and try to answer it yourself, and then I'll give you the answer real quick afterwards. So let's come up with some. What's the difference between how hydrophilic and hydrophobic hormones travel through the bloodstream? And the answer to that question is hydrophilic hormones travel easily through the bloodstream with no help because they're hydrophilic, they dissolve in the blood easily and they can travel easily. Hydrophobic hormones, however, need a carrier. They need to bind to a protein in the bloodstream in order to travel through the bloodstream because hydrophobic hormones can't dissolve easily in blood. Where's the receptor on or in the cell for hydrophobic hormones? And the answer to that is hydrophobic hormone receptors are found inside of the cell because the cell can easily, the hydrophobic hormone can easily move through the cell membrane. It can easily diffuse through the cell membrane. Sorry, my classroom has a motion detector for its lights. I think those are enough questions. Come up with some on your own and work on it on your own and try to do that compare and contrast question to go through the whole mechanism for both of those types of hormones and describe how they're similar and how they're different. Thank you once again for watching, and if you have any questions or anything, please leave them in the comments below.